And welcome back to another episode of the Double Doink Podcast. My name is Brendan Deek. Thank you so much for tuning in today. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button. It would be greatly appreciated. You can also rate the podcast and review the podcast wherever you listen to your podcast. It would also be greatly appreciated. Really looking forward to today's episode. I have a really cool guest lined up for us today. I am joined by Leigh Steinberg. He is a living legend himself. He has negotiated over $3 billion in contracts in the sporting world, MLB, NFL, you name it. He has done it. He is also I guess, Leigh, what would you say? Jerry Maguire was based off after you? Is that the right way to describe it?
Well, probably based on stories I told Cameron Crowe.
There we go. Okay, we'll dive into that. But my guest today is Leigh Steinberg. Leigh, how are we doing today?
Doing great.
Doing great. Okay, why don't we start from the beginning, Leigh? I want to talk about your childhood. So you were born and raised in the LA area. Leigh, kind of tell me about what your childhood was like, and were you a sports fan growing up?
Oh, I was. And my father took me to UCLA football. He had my parents had 5 degrees between them from UCLA, so we would go watch the basketball and the football. And then, of course, when the Dodgers came to Los Angeles, I fell in love with them. They won the World Series the second year, and loved the Dodgers, loved the Angels and the Lakers, and all things. We ended up having 2 of everything, like Noah's Ark, pro teams in every sport. So I did fall in love with all that, but Sandy Koufax and Maury Wills back in the day were my great heroes. My dad raised us with 2 core values. One was treasure relationships, especially family. And the second was try to make a meaningful difference in the world and help people who couldn't help themselves. So I was hardwired from birth to try to get out and heal people's pain and help people who couldn't help themselves. And my father was a high school principal. My mother was an audiovisual librarian, and we had 2 brothers, and we grew up in West Los Angeles in the 50s and 60s, and then I went off to UCLA for a year and then to Berkeley.
So just quickly want to touch back on your childhood. So were you always a good negotiator? Were you the guy in class negotiating for the brownie, maybe switching snacks with the kid next to you, getting that brownie for maybe the carrot sticks? Like, were you always negotiating, always in your blood as a kid?
Well, I think that the most important skill in all of that is the art of listening. If you can draw another person out and understand what their value system is, and put yourself in touch with their deepest anxieties and fears and their greatest hopes and dreams, you can navigate your way through life. If you can put yourself into another person's heart and their head and see the world the way they see it, then you can navigate your way through life effectively. So I was always interested in other people and trying to draw them out and understand, and peel back the layers of the onion and try to get deeper. So whether it was friendships or romance or student politics, it was always about that. It's really being able to pierce the veil that people put over themselves and to understand what really is going to fulfill them.
Okay, so you mentioned that you went to UC Berkeley. Why don't you just quickly tell my audience what you went to school for, and then on top of that, when did you know that you wanted to become a sports agent?
Never until I was one, because there wasn't really a field at the time I started. You could. Okay. There was no guaranteed right to negotiate. So a team like the Cincinnati Bengals could just slam down the phone and say, we don't deal with agents.
Interesting. Okay. I did not know that.
No field to aspire to. So I knew Berkeley in those days was the uproarious 1960s, and it was long hair and tie-dye and rock music and anti-Vietnam War.
Yeah.
And so I ended up student body president, and the governor at that time was a man named Ronald Reagan. And every time we demonstrated, he cracked down. So I learned everything I needed to learn about the art of negotiating from dealing with government with later President Reagan.
Interesting.
But I was a dorm counselor in an undergraduate dormitory, working my way through law school, and the freshman football team into the dorm. And one of the students was the quarterback on the team, Steve Bartkowski.
Yep.
So I was looking to make a difference in the world, go out and fight for civil rights or do something socially effective. And before I ever got there, and I had an offer from the DA's office and some offers in what's called corporate litigation, but I never got a chance to get there because in March of 1975, maybe it was February, the quarterback at that point had been drafted and was the number one pick overall in the draft.
That was 75, right? Was it 75? Yeah.
75, and asked me to represent him. So
really?
There I was, Brendan, overwhelming talents and experience. Just having practiced, and I had the first pick in the first round, and we got the largest rookie contract in NFL history. And but I saw then that athletes were the idol worship. Athletes were the venerated people. And I thought, well, I can take my dad's core values about making a difference. And if these athletes would go back and retrace their roots and go to the high school community that helped nurture them, they set up a scholarship fund or a boys and girls club and lay down roots and always have a home. And I thought, well, then if they went back to the college where the alums relate to the school primarily through the football or basketball program, if they set a scholarship fund up like Troy Aikman did at UCLA or Edgerrin James at the University of Miami or Kerry Collins at Penn State, they could join that community, be mentored by those alums. And then at the pro level, could we put a program together that would take some core condition in the world that an athlete would like to tackle and improve, and put together a charitable foundation with leading business figures, political figures, and community leaders on their board. And so that's work done putting the 200th single mother and their families into the first home they'll ever own. And I also saw athletes good brands. So later when I represented the heavyweight champ Lennox Lewis, he cut a public service announcement that said, "Real men don't hit women." And that could do more to trigger imitative behavior, especially in rebellious adolescents, than 1,000 authority figures ever could.
Wow, that's super interesting. So I got to go back to the Ronald Reagan thing. That just caught my attention. So did you ever like physically debate him like in person?
Yes, I did. There came a time where Nixon invaded Cambodia, and the campuses all took the classes off campus and in protest. And Governor Reagan didn't like that very much. It was a public university, and it was in rebellion. So we went in front of the Board of Regents, and at one point he looks at me and he said, so I'm trying to defend the chancellor who he's trying to fire. And he says, weren't you the same Mr. Steinberg that was arrested in 1960 sitting in front of troop trains in Oakland? And I said, well, Governor, I was about 10 years old and I was much closer to playing with toy trains than troop trains, but that shows your usual adherence to veracity and fact.
Yeah.
that got it going. And but later in the White House, he gave me a human rights commendation, and we laughed about it. But it wasn't so funny in 1970.
That's super interesting. Okay, so I want to talk. So Steve, I want to talk about like your kind of the beginning of you being an agent. So Steve was your very first client right off the bat. How old were you at that time?
25.
25 years old. What experience did you have before that to kind of jump into being the first overall picks agent? Like, what did you like take a course in school? Like, what did you kind of have to kind of help you do that and help him, I guess, get the money that he deserved?
The fact that I'd been involved in student politics and understood things politically. And so What I didn't understand about the structure of contracts and everything else, which was everything,
Mhm.
I did understand the concept of leverage, and there was a World Football League competing against the NFL at that time, so he had two choices. So the reality is, would he wanted to play in the World Football League? Probably not, but if the offer was life altering and life changing, like later we did with Steve Young or Mahomes, then that would be a different situation. So we were able to double what they had locked down on as an offer, and it eclipsed Joe Namath and O.J. Simpson, who had been the previous standard bearers.
Mhm. Interesting. Do you think that him being your first client kind of sets you up for the success that you would have? Like a lot of agents, like their first clients are maybe players that don't get drafted and whatnot. Do you think that maybe just having a high profile client like Steve kind of maybe like pedaled you for success?
Yes, because players like to be represented by someone who represents similarly situated players. And so
Hmm.
they see themselves in a different way. And if you can start, for example, at the quarterback position, which I ended up one weekend representing half the starting quarterbacks,
Yeah.
but if the first pick in the draft was a model, then later when I had a run where 6 out of 7 years I had the very first player in the first round in football, and then we went into baseball and basketball and other sports. But they're looking for an athlete's looking for who they model themselves after, and if it can, when you see the first pick, it's a record-breaking contract, then. But what I had to learn to do was profile clients. I learned that this whole role modeling approach was not going to appeal to everyone, and what I needed to be able to do was to figure out what type of athlete I might appeal to, and that
Hmm.
would be more effective.
Interesting. Okay, so you have your first client, Steve, and then how did things start growing? Like when did you kind of realize like, okay, I got something here. I have a legit company. Was there a certain player that you signed that maybe this clicked in your brain, or was it like a certain date? Kind of tell me like how the wheels started turning for you to become one of the biggest sports agent in history.
So in 1976, I had a year that would be good, I guess, for a lot of people, but wasn't multiple first rounders. And then I adjusted and I said, you know what, if I can just profile correctly and find people I can relate to. So let's limit the number of players that I talk to. And but let's have a higher percentage of the people that you actually sign.
Hmm.
And so that started to break loose in 77. I had an athlete, Ted Albrecht, who was a first round draft pick. In
Yep.
1978, I had two that were first round draft picks, and it sort of built from there. And then I had certain schools where we had special relationships, like living here in Los Angeles, or now I'm in Newport Beach. UCLA, SC were producing steady streams of first round athletes, and that was fortunate. And I'd gone to Cal, and they were producing, the Chuck Muncies of the world. It was a high draft pick, and so it started building that way, and then as we started doing the community and charitable programs, there was focus on second career. Could you find mentors in that collegiate alumni group that would help you in business? Could you
Hmm.
visualize a second career as an executive in sports, a coach, a business person, and what could we do to prepare for that? So that model ended up, growing and growing. And then in 1984, Warren Moon was ready to come back from Canada to enter the National Football League, and he was the first true free agent, because they had an option clause in contracts at that point where the player would have to play for a 10% raise if he couldn't reach a new agreement, and it meant that the player never had any freedom ever. So Warren comes back, and three different leagues are bidding on him, and he signs the biggest contract in history of the NFL. And then a month later, I did Steve Young with the USFL, who at that time signed a $42 million contract that made headlines around the world and across the country. And I know these figures seem de minimis now because money's so different. But so the combination of those two really got it, took it to another level. And then the next year, I had 4 of the first 12 picks in the first round.
So I think you've had a record 8 NFL first round draft picks, correct?
Yes, and you know what's more gratifying? 12 players in the Pro Football Hall of Fame.
Yeah. Okay, so when did you sell your firm? So you had a firm with 2 other people, I believe, correct? You guys sold it for $120 million. Is that correct?
And that was in the year 2000.
Year 2000.
The goal there was that across the country, different firms were trying to get into sports, and they didn't want to buy a pro team for what now is $5 billion. So what they looked at is if you get aggregate enough athletes in football, baseball, basketball, hockey, tennis, golf, other sports, it would produce a powerful marketing arm where you could market a team, a league, an individual, a coach, and there would be all that revenue. And then ultimately content, sports theme, motion pictures, television, video games. So it was a roll up, and so I went out and bought a series of sports agencies, another one in football, hockey, basketball, which had top players. But then that group went public at a certain point that had bought us, and they didn't want to be in the sports industry anymore.
Okay. Interesting. Okay, so I want to talk about the TED Talk you did. So you did a TED Talk about 9 years ago. Why don't you summarize to the audience about what that TED Talk was about? Because I gave it a listen last week, and it was awesome. It was one of the better TED Talks I've ever listened to. And how did that all?
Well, I think I talked about the fact that I had a father who said, when there comes a time when you see a problem to fix, as minor as picking something trash up off the floor, or as major as climate change or racism, the tendency is to look around for they or them, older people, political figures, experts, and to keep waiting for someone else to do it. And political figures, older people, business people. And my dad would look at me and say, you could wait forever, son. You are the they. The they is you. So we talked about the capacity of anybody to take charge of their own life and enhance it. And I think I probably talked about how I got started and the economics and the stunning nature of teams that when I started made $2 million from the national TV contract, and last year made $200 million. And in the midst of a cratered economy with a pandemic, CBS and Fox raised their offers for the next 10 years by 83%, or almost doubled it. And so sports are now rolling in revenue from television, from new stadia, from naming rights, from jumbo scoreboards, from fantasy sports, from in every possible way. And so when people look at big contracts and worry about the future of sports, teams are only paying those contracts because they're rolling in revenue.
Yep.
And I think I might have talked about my crusade against concussion.
Yep.
And brain injury. That I had a crisis of conscience back in the 1980s, late 80s, early 90s, because my players kept getting hit in the head. And when we would
you were like one of the first people that was kind of advocating against it, right? You were one of the first public kind of known people that didn't play in the game to kind of go against concussions.
Right. And so I thought, I've got to do something. And we started holding concussion seminars back in the 90s. And the first one had Steve Young and Warren Moon and Troy Aikman and Drew Bledsoe and Rob Johnson and a whole series of players. And we brought neurologists to try to see. And a little later, about in 2006, we had Ben and Amalu and a series of neurologists, and they said, we know the number. If you have 3 or more, it triggers an exponentially higher rate of Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, premature senility, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and depression. And so I called it a ticking time bomb and an undiagnosed health epidemic. And we've held 17 concussion seminars and are now starting to explore if there's finally healing, because the premise has been the concussed brain only gets worse over time. It never gets better. But now I've found a few different modalities in the biomed revolution that have the potential to cure a concussed brain.
So Leigh, you've again, we talked about at the beginning, you negotiated over $3 billion worth of contracts. You actually just helped negotiate Patrick Mahomes' contract, the richest contract in sports history. Again, congratulations on that. Is there a contract that stands out to you that you negotiated that kind of maybe still after all those years that still kind of thinks you're like, wow, that was really cool, or wow, that was different, that was interesting? Or is they all kind of just mend into one? Kind of tell me about maybe some cool stories about your time negotiating.
The 2 I talked about, Warren Moon, because it was the first time a player had ever been a free agent. Yep. Had 12 different teams bidding on him. So we go to down to Houston, and Bud Adams, who's the owner, says, look at that oil field. You can have a oil well there. And John Meekum, who owns the Saints, takes us out on a boat in the bay and says, this can all be yours. And Hugh Culverhouse, who runs Tampa, says, that's the Tampa sphere. You can own a floor if you sign with me. Wow. So it was the first time teams had to actually try to attract players.
Yeah.
We'd draft them, and then they had them forever. So that was exciting. And then the confluence of the USFL and the NFL, had the USFL only stayed the course, they probably would have been part of the NFL right now. But there was an owner who wanted to play in the fall, who later occupied a higher position in American government.
Is that named Donald Trump?
Who wanted to play in the fall, and the league dissolved. And but anyway, those are the exciting times. I think recognizing early on that sports could be a loss leader and help a network get people to watch its Monday through Friday primetime programming by pushing promos on their Sunday programming, that sports became a tool for network building. And the rights fees were loss leader. They would never make back the money on simple rights fees that they spent for, on advertising for what they spent on rights fees. So I talked to Rupert Murdoch once at our Super Bowl party, and I said, you should bid on NFL football. It'll build Fox. No one's watching 21 Jump Street in Beverly Hills 90210. You should bid, and he did. And so the dollars kept exploding. So it was seeing the future. It was also an understanding that the real battle in sports was not labor versus management. Mm-hmm. I would tell owners, when we have acrimonious negotiations, it just pushes fans away. Yeah. And when we have bad collective bargaining, the same. Our real competition for the NFL is not labor versus management. It's competition for discretionary entertainment spending. Mm-hmm. So our competition is the NBA, Major League Baseball, Walt Disney World, home box office, Netflix, and every other form of entertainment that people choose. And so we ought to be about building the brand.
It's funny, you went from, so you brought up the Warren Moon contract, right? That was 84, you said, right? 84, 85. Yeah. So that was the first time you saw teams actually having to pitch to players. Like the teams and the owners had all the power. Nowadays, like the perfect example, Kevin Durant just requested a trade today. Now the players have basically, like, the way that you probably watch go from ownership and teams have majority of the power. Now the power has almost translates to players, and you've been able to kind of see that whole thing unfold.
all that was necessary was free agency. Because once multiple bidders get into it, it does two things. Number one, the player has some power over where they're going to play based on their own values and priorities. So someone may prize winning over everything. Someone else might say, oh, no, it's just the money, I'll play anywhere. So you have to know in those situations what your client really prioritizes. But you're right, it restored the power. But now we have salary caps. So rookie negotiations in basketball and football are not where they once were, with long drawn out wars. All the players basically get the maximum for their slot, and then they get to camp on time.
Okay, so I want to talk about Patrick Mahomes. So he's probably your biggest client currently playing right now. How did you convince him to come for you to be his representation? How did that kind of process go on?
So Patrick Mahomes Sr. was a baseball pitcher, and so he had a lot of experience in sports. And so what happens in those situations is the parents are the screeners. So the parents take this flood of agents and marketing people and financial planners that are approaching each potential draft pick, and they do the screening. So we met with the parents, and the values matched. They wanted their son to be a role model. They wanted him to make a difference. They wanted him to have an exciting second career. So those values matched. So we probably met with them a couple times, maybe 3 times, and then didn't really meet Patrick till the end of the season. So we always thought that Patrick was undervalued coming off a college campus because people assumed that he was a gunslinger. And Texas Tech would be so far behind in games.
If he played with a good defense in college, he would have been way more well known, right?
So the point is that they would give up 50 points. So he was under pressure every single drive to score. So it meant he had chances, and he had to throw passes you wouldn't do if you had a more controlled situation and you weren't playing from behind. And so what they didn't understand was that he could entirely adapt because he was in, the air raid, modern passing off, that he could totally adapt to a 3-5-7 step drop and take the ball under center, and he could be a disciplined quarterback. So they missed all that. But through the process of scouting, people started to become aware, not the public, but people inside football. They looked at this freakish arm and athletic ability. They looked at the leadership qualities. They looked at how smart he was. They saw how he responded in pressure. And so it's more important to me to have a player at the top end of the draft go to a franchise with great ownership, great coaching, great front office stability than it is to have them go a couple picks higher. They may get a little more bonus, but then they might spend their career in misery. So it was so fortuitous that the Kansas City Chiefs, that fit all of that and had a quarterback whisperer and Andy Reid, were interested in him. And of course, they traded up in the draft to get him. Now, if you're watching, you may not be aware, but if you represent players, you're talking in scouting to all the teams interested in the player. You have a rough idea of which franchises are serious about taking your client.
Okay, last question for you, Leigh, then we'll get you out on this. I got to talk about Jerry Maguire before we go.
Okay.
So Leigh, it's actually my dad's favorite movie. He was all giddy when I was telling him I was going to interview you. So Leigh, why don't you just tell my audience how this all kind of came apart, because we do know that it's kind of based off of stories that you told. But who approached you? How did the whole thing kind of come together?
So Cameron Crowe was a writer-director who had gone underground in an LA high school to write a book called Fast Times at Ridgemont High, which turned into a really hilarious movie. And so he asked if he could follow me around and go wherever I went to a variety of different locales and pick up atmosphere that would lead to doing a movie based on a sports agent. And he went with me to the 93 draft where I had the first pick, Drew Bledsoe. He went to the press conference. He went to league meetings for a week where I introduced him to people, but he also was a fly on the wall, and he went to pro scouting day at SC, and I told him stories, lots and lots and lots of stories.
Okay.
And then as technical advisor, I had to vet the script to make sure that the look didn't seem phony or the dialogue didn't seem stilted. Then he signed me actors like Cuba Gooding Jr., who I took down to the the Super Bowl in Arizona, and I made him pretend he was a wide receiver all week. And I actually had to show the quarterback in the film, played by Jerry O'Connell, how to throw a spiral because he had gone to NYU and they didn't have football there.
Interesting.
So it's now been 25 years, and I rarely walk through an airport or go through go out to dinner where someone doesn't run up to the table and either say to me or ask me to say those 4 words that start with "Show me the."
So did that line come from you?
No, it came from Tim McDonald was a free agent safety, and
Okay.
Cameron was interviewing him about what he was looking for in free agency, and Lou Dobbs and Moneyline was on in the background, and Tim gestured sort of to the screen and said, "I'm looking for a team to show me winning. I'm looking for a team to show me respect. I'm looking for a team to show me economic security." And Cameron wrote, "Show me the money."
Interesting. Leigh Steinberg, thank you so much for doing this. Before we go, is there anything you want my listeners to take a look at? I know you're a very charitable guy. You have a lot of foundations and stuff like that. That's part of the reason I want to talk to you. Like, you are brilliant when it comes to giving back to the community. Is there anything you want the listeners to take a look at that you got going on?
We're going to have an agent academy later in the summer where if you're interested in being an agent or being involved in sports, if you go to SteinbergSports.com, you can find it.
Sounds good. Leigh Steinberg, thanks so much for doing this, man. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Okay, my pleasure.
Yeah.